In 1879, a man laughed while his daughter was stabbed. 6 months later, no one heard his laughter. Under the pale glow of a dying lantern, the laughter echoed through the wooden halls of a small countryside house in 1879. It was not the laughter of joy, nor of madness. It was something in between, the sound of a man who had forgotten what mercy felt like. Outside, the autumn wind howled across the empty fields, carrying with it the faint cry of a young girl. Inside, a father's cruel amusement mingled with the scent of iron and decay. Witnesses would later say his laughter didn't stop, even as the blade was drawn, even as the blood touched his shoes. He laughed until his voice broke, and then silence swallowed the room. 6 months later, that same silence returned to the house. But this time, it stayed. No one heard his laughter again, not his neighbors, not the parish priest, not even the crows that circled his roof every morning. Something had changed in that place, something that no one dared name aloud. The man who had once mocked his own daughter's death vanished without a trace. His doors remained locked from the inside, his windows sealed, his fire never lit again. What happened inside that house became a whispered warning in the nearby villages. If you hear laughter at midnight, don't answer. It might be him. This story isn't just a tale about cruelty or punishment. It's about the line between human guilt and something darker that watches from the other side. Tonight, you will uncover the truth behind the man's final night, and the reason why his laughter was the last sound anyone ever heard from that home. But stay with me until the end, because there's one piece of evidence, one forbidden detail, that was hidden for over a century, and I'll reveal it only when the full truth comes to light. They say history buries its monsters, but sometimes it buries them alive. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them clawing their way back through the soil of forgotten sins. What you're about to hear is not folklore, not rumor. It's documented, recorded, and traced to a single man who thought laughter could silence pain. He was wrong. Before we begin, take a moment to imagine that sound, the laughter of a man who believed himself untouchable, and remember it, because by the time this story ends, you'll understand why no one in that town ever dared to laugh again. And believe me, when you discover what they found 6 months later, you'll wish the story had ended with that scream. The year was 1879, a time when America still trembled under the weight of its own ghosts. The Civil War had ended barely a decade earlier, yet the wounds of the nation had not closed. In small rural towns scattered across the Midwest, whispers of old violence still clung to every wooden beam, every church bell, every rusted plow left forgotten in a field. The Industrial Revolution was crawling slowly westward, but in certain corners of Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, life remained trapped in another century, one ruled by superstition, solitude, and fear of divine punishment. The house in question stood at the edge of a dying village known only as Ashford Hollow, a place so small that most maps never bothered to mark it. The land around it was once fertile, but by 1879 the soil had turned acidic and the crops refused to grow. Locals said it was cursed ground, that the earth itself rejected the blood spilled there generations earlier. The house was 2 stories of grey timber, leaning slightly as though the weight of its secrets pulled it closer to the ground. No one knew exactly when it had been built, only that it had always been there, standing on the outskirts like an unwanted memory. Inside, the furniture was sparse, carved by hand, each piece a testament to poverty and pride. The walls, made from pine that had long since darkened, held the faint scent of smoke and something else, something damp and metallic. Those who entered claimed they felt the air change, heavy and pressing, as if the house itself was breathing. Windows were narrow and fogged from the inside, muting the light and giving the illusion that night began earlier there than anywhere else. It was here that Thomas Alder lived, a widower a farmer, and a man who had once been known for his strange laughter. He had come to Ashford Hollow with his wife and infant daughter in the early 1860s, seeking quiet after the chaos of war. But life in that town was not kind to outsiders. The villagers distrusted him, his sharp tongue, and the way he always seemed to find humor in tragedy. When his wife died suddenly in the spring of 1873, they said he didn't cry. Instead, he laughed. Some believed he had gone mad with grief. Others whispered that he had made some kind of pact, that laughter was his payment for something he had received. By the late 1870s, superstition had turned to quiet avoidance. No one visited his home. No one saw the girl, Mary Alder, outside anymore. The neighbors heard the faint sound of a piano at dusk, her playing delicate and haunting, often drowned out by her father's laughter. Then, one stormy night, that music stopped forever. And though the villagers never saw what happened, they all heard the sound, a scream, a crash, and that laughter echoing into the rain. The sheriff who arrived the next morning found the door unlocked, the piano smashed, and the floorboards stained dark. But the girl was gone. Thomas claimed she had run away after a fight, that she would return. The sheriff didn't believe him, but without proof, there was nothing to do but leave him to his grief or his guilt. For 6 months, the house stood silent. Then suddenly, it wasn't. That winter, travelers passing along the old road swore they saw light flickering in the windows again. Some heard faint laughter carried by the wind. Others saw a figure standing by the second-floor window, a man smiling, even though no fire burned inside. The few who dared to approach said the house felt colder than the air around it, that the laughter wasn't coming from the living room, but from beneath the floor. And from that moment on, Ashford Hollow was never the same. The villagers stopped using the road, children were forbidden to play near the fields, and the church began holding nightly vigils. Yet the laughter returned again and again, mocking, distant and wrong, until one morning it stopped for good. Thomas Alder had once been a man the townsfolk pitied. A tall figure with a proud posture and sun-scarred hands, he carried himself like someone who had fought life and won, even when it was clear he was losing. Before the tragedy, he'd been known for his strange humor. He would laugh at funerals, smile at bad news, and make light of storms that frightened everyone else. Some said it was his way of surviving the darkness that had always followed him. Others said the darkness had found a perfect host. His daughter Mary was the opposite in every way. Where Thomas's laughter was sharp and unsettling, Mary's presence was gentle, fragile, and quiet. She was 16 when the winter of 1879 began, slender, with pale hands that knew the piano better than the world outside her window. Her mother's death had left her timid, withdrawn, yet achingly kind. Neighbors who remembered her said she used to leave flowers by the graves of strangers, whispering names aloud so they wouldn't be forgotten. In a place like Ashford Hollow, such tenderness was often mistaken for weakness. Her father saw it differently. He saw in her the reflection of the woman he'd lost, and perhaps the reminder of everything he had destroyed. There were others too, minor figures whose lives brushed against the alders just long enough to leave a scar. Mrs. Hargrove, the midwife who had delivered Mary, was among the last to enter the house before the incident. She later confessed that Thomas had changed after his wife's death, that his laughter had become something inhuman. The local priest, Father Keane, visited once a month, bringing food and scripture. He would sit by the fireplace speaking softly of redemption, while Thomas stared into the flames, grinning at something no one else could see. Each time the priest left, he swore the house felt colder behind him. And then there was Jonah Wells, the blacksmith's son and Mary's only friend. He often left small notes for her between the slats of the garden fence, written on scraps of paper smudged with coal dust. "Play tonight. One note read, "The fields sound lonely." Sometimes she did, and Jonah would listen from the shadows, the music soft as breath. It was Jonah who claimed that on the night of the murder he heard not just laughter, but another voice, a faint whisper that repeated the same word over and over, though he couldn't make out what it was. He ran for help, but by the time he returned with the sheriff, the laughter had already stopped. Each of these people carried their own fragment of the story, though none understood its full weight. Thomas was a man consumed by guilt, or something darker that wore guilt like a mask. Mary was the fragile heartbeat of a home that had forgotten warmth, and the others, unknowingly, were witnesses to a curse that had been unfolding long before that fateful night. There's a moment in every tragedy when the living sense that something unseen has already chosen its ending. For the people of Ashford Hollow, that moment came when Mary stopped playing. Her piano had been the only sound that reminded them there was still innocence in that house. When it went silent, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Some prayed, others locked their doors, and Thomas, standing by the broken window, simply laughed, as if he'd finally understood that there was no turning back. The first real clue that something was terribly wrong came not from the sheriff or the townsfolk, but from the house itself. Months after Mary's disappearance, when no one dared step across its threshold, a storm swept through Ashford Hollow, tearing shingles from roofs and uprooting trees. The next morning, the wind had thrown open one of the shutters on the older home. From the road, Mrs. Hargrove noticed something glinting in the upper window, something that caught the light like glass or metal. Against her better judgment, she approached. Through the dust-streaked pane, she could see the faint outline of the piano, toppled on its side, its strings exposed like ribs. And just above it, carved into the wooden wall, were 3 letters, uneven, jagged, and fresh. They spelled a single word: listen. No one could explain how it got there. The sheriff swore he had inspected that very wall the night of the disappearance, and there had been nothing. No carvings, no marks, just the splintered wood of the piano. The word seemed burned into the grain itself, as though the letters had been seared there from within. Some thought it was Thomas's work, another cruel game from a man unhinged by guilt. Others whispered it was Mary's final message, scratched into the wood before the blade fell. Whatever it meant, it reignited something in the townspeople, a mixture of dread and curiosity they couldn't suppress. That night, Jonah Wells returned to the property, lantern in hand. The snow had begun to fall again, thick and soundless, covering the broken fence and the path that led to the back door. He swore later that he heard faint notes, just 3, from the piano. Not a melody, not a song, just 3 lonely tones echoing in the dark. He called Mary's name once. The sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so heavy, it made his breath visible in the air. He turned to leave, but before he did, he noticed something else. Footprints in the snow, leading away from the house. Small, bare prints, fading as they reached the field. He followed them until they vanished near the old oak where Mary used to sit. There, in the roots, half buried in ice, he found a handkerchief embroidered with her initials and stained dark. The sheriff dismissed the story, saying the footprints could have been Jonah's own and that the blood was from an animal. But the townsfolk were less sure. They had seen too much, heard too much, to believe in coincidence. Rumors spread that Thomas was not alone in the house, that his laughter was a response to something unseen. Some claimed to see candlelight flickering through the cracks at odd hours, even though no one ever entered. Others said they heard tapping, 3 slow knocks, always 3, from the inside walls, as though someone were trying to send a message from behind the boards. By early spring, the legend had already taken form. Children dared each other to walk past the older house at dusk. None made it farther than the front gate. They said the air grew colder there, that if you listened long enough, you could hear a faint whisper beneath the wind. Listen. No one knew whether it was a warning or a plea. But one thing was certain: the house was not done speaking. By the spring of 1880, Ashford Hollow had turned against the memory of Thomas Alder. What little pity they once had for him had long since soured into fear and disgust. He was rarely seen in daylight, and when he was, his face looked drained, paler, thinner, his eyes sunken as though he hadn't slept in months. Some said he wandered the fields at night, muttering to himself, laughing under his breath as if someone walked beside him. The few who dared to confront him were met with silence, or worse, that same eerie grin that never reached his eyes. The injustice of Mary's death or disappearance hung over the town like a curse. There had been no trial, no confession, not even a proper burial. The sheriff's report called it a domestic dispute resulting in an unresolved absence. But the villagers knew what that meant: no justice, no closure, and no peace for the dead. In 19th century America, a woman's suffering often dissolved into rumor. Mary was reduced to whispers and cautionary tales, her life measured by the cruelty of her father. And Thomas, the man who should have faced judgment, was allowed to rot in his home, free to laugh in the face of his own sin. Father Keene visited once more that spring, determined to offer redemption before it was too late. He found the house in disarray, dust thick in the corners, furniture overturned, and the smell of damp wood filling the air. Thomas sat in his chair by the fireless hearth, eyes fixed on the empty piano bench. When the priest spoke of confession, Thomas only chuckled. "She listens," he said softly, almost kindly. "She always listens." The priest left in silence, his hands trembling as he locked the gate behind him. Word of that encounter spread quickly. The townsfolk grew restless. Justice, long denied, began to take another shape. Vengeance. A small group of men gathered in secret, led by Jonah Wells, who could no longer bear the thought of Mary's spirit trapped in that place. "If the law won't act," he told them, "then we will." They waited for a moonless night, carrying lanterns, rope, and the kind of righteous fury born from years of fear. When they reached the house, the door was already open. The smell that poured from within stopped them cold. Rot, smoke, and something faintly sweet, like decay mixed with perfume. Inside, the air pulsed with heat, though no fire burned. The word "listen" had been carved again, this time on the floorboards, deeper, more desperate. Jonah raised his lantern, and for the first time they saw the walls. Every surface was covered in drawings, childlike scrawls made with charcoal and ash. Some showed a woman's face, others crude outlines of a piano, a knife, and a pair of hands reaching upward. In one corner, written in frantic loops, were the words, "She's not dead." That night, the men fled without lighting a match or taking revenge. They couldn't explain what they saw, only that the sound of soft laughter followed them all the way back to the village. The next morning, Thomas Alder was found sitting in his chair, his eyes open, his mouth frozen in a faint, broken smile. He was dead. Yet even in death, the injustice remained, because no one knew whether he had finally met punishment or if something far older had claimed him first. The morning after Thomas Alder's death, a heavy fog rolled over Ashford Hollow, swallowing the fields and muffling every sound. The villagers gathered outside the house, afraid to go in but unable to turn away. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies and Father Keene, who crossed himself the moment they stepped through the door. The air inside was thick and sour, and though the fire had long gone cold, the room still radiated a faint warmth, like the dying breath of something that refused to leave. Thomas's body sat in his chair exactly as Jonah had described, his hands resting on his knees, his mouth slightly open as though caught mid-laugh. But there was something else, a thin trail of blood trickling from his left ear and the unmistakable imprint of a child's hand on his shoulder, outlined in soot. They searched the house cautiously. Every door creaked like a whisper. Upstairs, the deputies found a locked trunk beneath Mary's bed. The wood was warped and the iron latch nearly fused shut. It took both men to pry it open. Inside were small keepsakes, a ribbon, a locket, a cracked mirror, and beneath them, a stack of yellowed pages bound with twine. They weren't letters nor a diary, but fragments of sheet music, each one marked with uneven handwriting that didn't belong to a trained musician. Across the margins were strange notes written in the same charcoal used on the walls downstairs. Hear her. The song keeps her. She never stopped playing. When Father Keene held one of the pages to the light, he noticed faint stains in the paper, fingerprints, smudged and brown with age. "It's blood," he whispered, before quickly folding the sheets and pressing them to his chest as if to silence them. Jonah, who stood in the doorway, stared at the piano. One of its keys had been wedged down permanently, as though a weight still pressed against it. He reached out and touched it. The sound that escaped was soft, brittle, but unmistakably clear. And then a second note followed, on its own. The deputies drew their guns. The air grew colder, dense enough that their breath turned to fog. Somewhere deep inside the walls, something began to knock. 3 times, slow, deliberate. The same rhythm Jonah had heard that winter night. "Who's there?" the sheriff demanded, his voice trembling despite himself. No answer came, only another faint tap, this time from under the floorboards. They pried them open, expecting to find vermin or hollow space. Instead, they uncovered a narrow passage leading down into darkness. A tunnel. The smell was unbearable, earth, mold, and something that had once been human. Father Keene insisted they leave it sealed, but Jonah dropped his lantern into the hole. For a moment, its light flickered against the dirt walls and revealed what lay below, a small wooden chair, a pair of broken chains, and something that glittered faintly beside them. A silver hairpin shaped like a bird. It was Mary's. Everyone in the village recognized it. The sheriff closed the floor and said nothing more, but word spread quickly. The truth no one wanted to face was now undeniable. Mary had not vanished. She had been kept there, beneath the house, beneath her father's feet, playing music for a man who no longer saw her as his daughter, but as an echo of his sins. And whatever had died in that darkness had not rested. That night, the laughter returned, soft at first, drifting from the fields. But this time, it was joined by something else, the faint, hollow sound of a piano, playing 3 perfect notes over and over, as though calling for someone to listen. For weeks after the discovery, beneath the Alder house, Ashford Hollow refused to speak of what they had found. The sheriff sealed the property and ordered everyone to stay away, but fear has a way of slipping through locked doors. People swore they heard the piano again, faint but steady, drifting through the fog at night. The melody was never complete, just 3 repeating notes, echoing like a heartbeat. And each time it played, the lights in the old house flickered, though there was no fire within and no one inside to tend it. Jonah Wells couldn't let it rest. Guilt gnawed at him. The belief that if he had gone to Mary sooner, if he had defied her father, maybe she would still be alive. One night, unable to bear the silence, he broke the sheriff's order and returned to the house. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the fields stretched black and endless. As he stepped inside, the air felt heavier, as though it recognized him. The piano key was still pressed down. The room still stank of rot and damp wood. But on the table near Thomas's chair, Jonah noticed something new, a journal, half-burned, that no one had seen before. Its cover was scorched, its pages warped, but a few entries were still legible. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. The first lines read like confessions. "She won't stop playing, even when I tell her to rest." Another entry, dated weeks before Mary's disappearance, was more frantic. The voice says the laughter keeps her close, the song keeps her listening. And then the final words, written in jagged strokes. "If I stop laughing, she'll take me too." Jonah felt the room tighten around him. The laughter, the one everyone had heard the night Mary died, wasn't madness. It had been fear. A man's desperate attempt to drown out something he couldn't understand. The question that haunted Jonah's mind now wasn't what Thomas had done, but what he had seen. As he turned to leave, a soft rustle came from upstairs. The air smelled faintly of violets, Mary's perfume. He froze. The steps creaked once, twice, slow and deliberate. When he raised his lantern toward the staircase, the flame wavered. On the top step lay the silver hairpin, the same one found in the tunnel below. It was clean now, shining, as though it had just been placed there. Jonah called her name, voice shaking. No answer came, only 3 piano notes, faint and distant, rising from beneath the floorboards once more. He ran into the night, the hairpin still warm in his hand. The next morning, when the sheriff and Father Keene returned to the house, the journal was gone. In its place, carved into the wooden table, were 3 new words. "She's still listening." No one knew who or what had written them. But one thing was certain, the story was far from over. The discovery of Thomas Alder's journal should have ended the matter, but instead, it opened a new wound in Ashford Hollow, one that reached deeper than anyone had imagined. When Father Keene and the sheriff examined what little evidence remained, they found something strange in the margins of the recovered pages, faint symbols, etched not with ink, but with a needle. Circles, crescents and markings that resembled early occult sigils, the kind whispered about in apocryphal church texts. The priest recognized one immediately, the mark of Ordeer, a name that appeared only once in forbidden Latin manuscripts. It meant the one who listens. The more Father Keene investigated, the more he realized that what had happened inside the Alder house was not an isolated act of madness. Parish records revealed that the land on which the house stood had belonged to the church nearly a century earlier, when it was used as a burial site for plague victims. During the epidemic, priests had conducted rituals meant to seal the cries of the dying so that their suffering would not linger. According to one account, those rites failed. The locals began reporting voices, wails and whispers that bled through the soil at night. The land was sold quietly, without blessing, and no priest ever served there again. Thomas Alder had unknowingly built his home upon that ground, but perhaps, as the old stories suggested, the ground had chosen him. His ancestors were said to have come from a line of men known for their laughter, men who claimed it warded off spirits. In a cruel twist of fate, Thomas's laughter, the thing that made him peculiar to his neighbors, may have been his only defense against what had taken root beneath his home. Jonah Wells continued searching through what remained of the house after the sheriff's final inspection. In the ash of the fireplace, he found metal fragments, thin rods that once belonged to the piano's inner frame. They were bent into small loops, arranged with deliberate care. Beneath them, half-burned sheet music lay scattered. The notes were incomplete, but when Jonah took them to the town's old music teacher, something astonishing happened. The man, nearly blind with age, ran his fingers across the paper and whispered, "This is not music, it's language." The pattern of notes matched a rhythm similar to Morse code, short and long bursts, organized in threes. When transcribed, the message spelled out a chilling phrase: "He made her listen." The implication was clear. The piano had not just been an instrument of comfort, but of control, a medium through which Thomas, willingly or not, had bound something to his home. Father Keene, horrified by what he learned, returned to the church archives, only to discover a final record missing. the one that detailed the original ritual performed on the land. The pages had been torn out. When he asked the diocese for assistance, he was told no such ritual had ever existed. And yet the same sigil found in Thomas S. journal appeared carved into the underside of the church, S. altar stone, hidden from the congregation's view. That night, Father Keane was seen walking toward the altar house one last time, clutching his rosary so tightly that his fingers bled. He told the sheriff he intended to bless the ground, to silence the listener once and for all, but he never returned. When Jonah and the sheriff followed at dawn, they found the front door ajar and the floorboards pried open. The tunnel beneath was empty. The chair was gone. And in the silence that followed, the piano began to play again, 3 notes slow and deliberate. On the wall above the instrument, new words had appeared, written in the same soot-black script as before. Some laughter never dies. At dawn on the 12th day after Father Keane vanished, the fog lifted from Ashford Hollow for the first time in months. The fields shimmered with frost, and the alder house stood bare and quiet beneath a grey sky. Jonah Wells, haunted by the last words carved into its wall, returned alone. He believed the priest's body, or perhaps his soul, was still inside, trapped like Mary's had been. This time he brought with him a single candle, a small cross, and a courage born not from faith, but from desperation. When he stepped inside, the silence was almost unbearable. Dust hung motionless in the air, the house heavy with the scent of damp wood and iron. The piano sat in its place, untouched, the same single key pressed down as before. Jonah whispered a prayer and struck a match. The flame flickered weakly, casting long shadows that stretched and warped across the walls. For a moment everything was still, until the candlelight fell upon something new, carved into the wood above the fireplace. 3 simple words. I hear you. He called out for Father Keane. No answer came, only a faint hum, so soft at first it could have been the wind, but it grew steadily, resonating through the floorboards, trembling up through his boots and into his chest. Jonah knelt, pressing his ear to the ground. Beneath him, a voice was whispering. It wasn't Mary's. It wasn't Thomas's. It was something colder, something that seemed to echo from below the earth itself. He laughed, it said, so I listened. Jonah's candle guttered. A shape moved in the corner of his vision, small, fragile, like a child's silhouette swaying near the piano. He froze. Slowly, the figure turned. Its face was pale and indistinct, eyes black and hollow as the tunnels below, and then the piano began to play. Not the 3 notes this time, but a melody, slow, deliberate, and hauntingly beautiful. The same song Mary used to play, now twisted, deeper, filled with sorrow. As the music grew, the room itself seemed to breathe. The wallpaper curled, the air thickened, and Jonah felt something tugging at his chest, a rhythm that wasn't his own heartbeat. Then came the laughter. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Thomas's laughter echoing from the walls, from the piano, from the very bones of the house. It mingled with the melody until the 2 sounds became one, the laugh and the song, weaving together in a terrible harmony. Jonah stumbled backward, eyes wide. The figure by the piano lifted its head. It was Mary, or what was left of her. Her lips moved soundlessly, and then the voice that filled the room was not hers, but Thomas's, pleading, desperate, broken. Make it stop. Jonah dropped to his knees, shouting over the noise. Mary, you're free! He's gone! You don't have to stay here! But the music only grew louder. The notes bled into each other, dissolving into chaos. The floorboards cracked beneath him, and for a moment he thought the entire house was sinking. Then the voice changed. It became softer, almost human again. He laughed while I died, it whispered. Now he laughs forever. Jonah turned toward the sound and froze. The piano bench was empty, but on the wall behind it, the shadow of a man was laughing. It had no body, no face, only a trembling outline cast by a flame that shouldn't have been strong enough to create it. And then Jonah understood. Thomas Alder hadn't escaped justice. His laughter hadn't been madness or cruelty. It had been the only thing keeping the entity from consuming him entirely. When the laughter stopped, it took him. When Father Keane tried to silence it, it took him too. The melody shifted again, slower now, softer. A final note rang out, pure and cold, and then the sound vanished completely. The candle extinguished itself. Jonah stood in darkness, and in that silence, for the first time, he heard breathing, steady, shallow, right behind him. He turned slowly. Nothing, only the open doorway and the faint light of dawn spilling across the threshold. He stepped outside, gasping for air, clutching the small cross so tightly it cut into his palm. The house stood quiet again, lifeless. But when he looked down, he saw the frost on the ground had melted in a perfect circle around the doorway, as if the house itself was exhaling. Days later, when the sheriff came looking for Jonah, he found the man's lantern and cross lying by the gate, but Jonah was gone. The house was finally burned to the ground, and the ashes scattered in the river. For a brief time, Ashford Hollow felt lighter, free. But on the night of the first thaw, a traveller passing through swore he heard laughter drifting over the fields, soft, distant, and unmistakably human. It was followed by 3 faint piano notes. When the ashes of the Alder house finally settled, Ashford Hollow returned to a strange and heavy stillness. People spoke of moving on, of rebuilding what was lost, yet no one dared touch the ground where the house had once stood. The laughter was gone, the music had stopped, but something about the air there still felt alive, like a breath held too long, waiting to be released. The older townsfolk avoided the subject altogether, while the younger ones whispered about Jonah Wells, the man who had vanished chasing a ghost of justice. In time, the story of Thomas and Mary Alder faded into something between a cautionary tale and a local myth. But those who truly listened to the echoes of that history could still sense the weight of its truth. It was never about the laughter itself. It was about what it represented. A man's attempt to mask his guilt. A community's silence in the face of horror. A family destroyed not just by cruelty, but by the refusal to see it for what it was. History often buries its monsters beneath polite words and decaying wood. But in that house, the walls themselves had remembered. They carried the screams, the prayers, and the twisted symphony of pain until someone finally dared to listen. Jonah E.'s discovery wasn't a tea just of a haunting. It was a mirror held up to a time when sins could hide behind wealth, religion, and respectability. And that, perhaps, is why the story lingers. Because injustice rarely dies with the guilty. It seeps into the soil, waiting to be unearthed again. For every Mary whose voice was silenced, there were countless others who never even had a name carved into a wall. And for every Thomas who laughed, thinking his cruelty would fade with time, there is always someone like Jonah, someone who refuses to let the silence win. The people of Ashford Hollow didn't speak of that legacy, but they carried it quietly, like a scar beneath the skin. They learned that evil isn't always a roaring fire. Sometimes it's the quiet hum of a piano in an empty room. Even now, when visitors come to what's left of the town, they say the place feels heavier than it should. Some claim it's superstition, others say it's memory, but maybe it's neither. Maybe it's the land itself, holding on to what it witnessed, the cruelty, the laughter, and the desperate attempt to make sense of both. Because history, at its core, is not about ghosts or curses. It's about remembrance. It's about what happens when humanity looks away and what it costs to finally look back. The story of Ashford Hollow is not a tale of the supernatural, but a confession written across time, that silence protects no one, and that some laughter, especially the kind that hides a scream, should never be forgotten. If you've stayed with me until this point, you already know. This story isn't just about a haunted house or a man who lost his soul to the sound of his own laughter. It's about how silence becomes an accomplice to evil and how the echoes of injustice never really die. And now I want to know what you think. Do you believe Thomas Alder was cursed by something beyond this world, or was he simply consumed by his own guilt? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes it's not the answers that matter most. It is the questions we dare to ask. And remember that promise I made at the beginning? Here it is. According to local archives, there was one more page found, a torn scrap discovered weeks after the ruins were cleared. On it, written in trembling ink, were 4 words. The listener still waits. No one knows who wrote it. No one ever claimed to. But it was dated 6 months after the house burned down. So now I'll ask you, do you think the curse ended there, or did it just move on? If stories like this make your pulse quicken, if you crave the hidden corners of history that others are too afraid to touch, this is your place. Subscribe, join our growing circle of truth seekers, and turn on the bell, because every week we uncover another story buried beneath centuries of silence. And if you believe that some histories are too dark to stay forgotten, type in the comments, "I want to remember." Ashford Hollow never rebuilt the Alder house. The land was left to the weeds, the laughter long gone, the music silenced. But the silence itself became its own kind of voice, a reminder that history never truly disappears. It waits, buried in soil and whispers, until someone curious enough dares to dig again. Tonight, we've walked through ashes and echoes, through a father's madness, a daughter's suffering, and a town's unwillingness to listen. Yet this story, dark as it is, isn't an ending. It's a door, because every shadow has a twin somewhere in history, another tragedy, another silence that still hums beneath the surface. Maybe that's why people still visit the ruins of the Alder home. They leave tokens at the edge of the field, a cross, a ribbon, a single music note carved into stone. And sometimes they swear they hear faint laughter drifting through the trees. Others insist it's just the wind. But the truth, some sounds never belong entirely to the past. So as we close this chapter, remember this: every ghost story begins with something real. Behind every superstition, there's a wound that history refused to heal. And the only way to stop the echoes is to listen. Thank you for staying until the end, for giving voice to what time tried to erase. If you've made it here, type below, "I guard the memory." Because this isn't just a story we tell, it is one we keep alive. And next time, we travel further into the forgotten, to a small coastal village in 1884, where fishermen claimed the sea itself began to whisper their names, and one by one they vanished beneath the waves. Until then, keep your light close, and your laughter quieter than the dark.